Junko Furuta was just 17 years old when her life was violently taken from her. What should have been the carefree days of a young high school student turned into a nightmare that no one could have imagined. On November 25, 1988, she was abducted by a group of boys who would subject her to 44 days of unimaginable torture and suffering. Her story is one of cruelty beyond comprehension, a reminder of the darkness that can exist in the world. Junko's tragic fate has haunted Japan for decades, and the horror of what she endured is something that still resonates today. Junko Furuta was a bright, 17-year-old high school student living in Saitama, Japan. She was known for her kindness, good grades, and cheerful personality. Like many teenagers, Junko had dreams for her future. She was dedicated to her studies and had plans to attend university, hoping to build a successful career. Friends described her as hardworking and full of life, someone who was always smiling and had a promising future ahead. Junko's life was tragically cut short, and the world never got to see the potential she carried within her. On the evening of November 25, 1988, Junko Furuta's life took a horrifying turn. While walking home from her part-time job, she was targeted by a group of 4 teenage boys. One of them, Hiroshi Miyano, a known delinquent, had been watching Junko for a while. That night, the group hatched a cruel plan to abduct her. Miyano approached Junko on the street, pretending to be a stranger, and knocked her off her bicycle. Pretending to offer help, he then lured her to a secluded area. Once there, the rest of the group joined him, and they forcefully abducted Junko, taking her to a house where her nightmare would begin. What followed was a tragedy that shocked Japan and continues to haunt people to this day. In the first days of her captivity, Junko Furuta was held in a house belonging to one of her captors. At first, her captors tried to manipulate her into cooperating, telling her she would be released if she stayed quiet. But quickly, their treatment turned brutal. Junko was subjected to beatings and verbal abuse, stripped of her freedom and dignity. Her captors kept her locked in a room where they controlled her every move. Despite the promises they made, they had. As the days turned into weeks, Junko Furuta's suffering escalated. Her captors began to subject her to unimaginable torture. They beat her regularly using metal rods and burned her with cigarettes. She was deprived of food and water, forcing her to survive on very little. Junko endured sexual abuse, often at the hands of not only her captors but others they allowed into the house. Her physical and mental state deteriorated as the abuse became more severe. Despite her efforts to resist, the torture continued with no sign of relief. Her pain and isolation only deepened. Beyond the physical torture, Junko Furuta's captors used psychological tactics to break her spirit. They humiliated her constantly, stripping away her dignity and self-worth. By isolating her from the outside world, they created a sense of hopelessness, making her feel as though escape was impossible. They manipulated her into believing that no one would come to help her, further deepening her sense of isolation. The threats against her family were particularly cruel, using her love for them as a weapon to control her. This psychological torment ensured she remained under their complete dominance, with little will to resist. When Junko Furuta disappeared, the local community was largely unaware of the true horror she was enduring. Initially, there was little immediate response, as her captors went to great lengths to conceal their crime. Her family reported her missing, but authorities did not treat the case with the urgency it required, assuming she had run away. The lack of strong police action frustrated her loved ones. Neighbors and those in the area did not suspect anything unusual, despite hearing noises, as the captors had made it appear as though Junko was staying with friends voluntarily. The community's response was muted, with many unaware of the tragedy unfolding right in their midst. Junko Furuta's ordeal was a prolonged nightmare of unimaginable cruelty. Over the course of 44 days, she was subjected to brutal physical, emotional, and sexual abuse by her captors. They beat her repeatedly, burned her with cigarettes, and deprived her of food and water for long periods. The violence escalated with each passing day, as they devised new ways to torment her, breaking bones and causing severe internal injuries. Junko was also assaulted multiple times, both physically and psychologically. The cruelty inflicted on her was relentless, leaving her in unbearable pain. Despite her attempts to endure, her body and spirit slowly weakened under the constant abuse, creating a story of suffering that remains hard to comprehend. The investigation into Junko Furuta's disappearance was tragically flawed from the start. After her abduction, her family reported her missing, but initial police efforts fell short. There were missed opportunities and a lack of urgency in the search for Junko. At one point, officers even visited the house where she was being held but were misled by her captors, who claimed that the girl inside was not Junko. The failure to act quickly allowed her captors to continue their horrific abuse, prolonging her suffering. The lack of thorough investigation and follow-up left Junko without the help she so desperately needed, a mistake that would haunt the case forever. Throughout her horrific captivity, Junko Furuta made several desperate attempts to escape or signal for help. On one occasion, she managed to get to a phone and tried to call the police, but her captors caught her before she could complete the call. As punishment, they intensified their abuse, brutally beating her for trying to get away. There were also times when neighbors heard strange noises coming from the house, but no one acted on their suspicions. Tragically, each failed attempt at escape or signal for help only led to further violence and suffering, deepening Junko's nightmare. After enduring 44 days of unimaginable torture, Junko Furuta's suffering came to a tragic end on January 4, 1989. Her captors, having subjected her to relentless physical and psychological abuse, finally inflicted fatal injuries. They beat her repeatedly, burned her body, and left her in a severely weakened state. Junko ultimately succumbed to her injuries, unable to withstand the brutal treatment any longer. After her death, her captors stuffed her body into a 55-gallon drum and filled it with concrete, attempting to conceal the evidence of their horrific crime. This marked the heartbreaking end of Junko Furuta's life, a young girl whose future was violently stolen. Junko Furuta's body was discovered after one of her captors confessed to the crime during an unrelated police interrogation. On January 23, 1989, authorities located her remains in a 55-gallon drum filled with concrete, hidden in Koto, Tokyo. The details that emerged about her death shocked the public and law enforcement. Investigators uncovered the horrifying extent of her suffering from the torture, repeated assaults, and neglect that led to her slow, painful demise. The revelation of these horrors sent waves of outrage and disbelief throughout Japan, leading to a national conversation about justice and youth crime. Following the confession, police swiftly arrested the 4 boys responsible for Junko Furuta's abduction and murder. The main perpetrators, who were all teenagers at the time, were taken into custody, and the gruesome details of their crime were revealed to the public. As the news spread, public outrage erupted across Japan. People were shocked not only by the brutality of the crime, but also by the fact that these young individuals could commit such heinous acts. The anger intensified when it was revealed that the captors had managed to avoid detection for so long, despite Junko being held captive for over a month. The case sparked widespread calls for justice and severe punishment for the perpetrators. The trial of Junko Furuta's captors began in 1990 and drew massive public attention. During the proceedings, the horrific details of Junko's torture were laid bare. The defense attorneys tried to argue that the boys were not fully responsible for their actions, citing their young age and claiming they were influenced by peer pressure. However, the evidence against them was overwhelming. The court heard testimonies from witnesses and reviewed confessions made by the captors. The brutality of their actions shocked the nation. In the end, the sentences handed down were controversial. While one of the main perpetrators received a lengthy prison term, others were given lighter sentences due to their age at the time of the crime. The leniency sparked outrage among the public and victims' rights advocates, who felt justice had not been served for Junko Furuta. The trial highlighted deep flaws in the legal system, particularly regarding how youth offenders were treated. After Junko Furuta's tragic death, a wave of anger and grief swept through Japan. The brutality of her case struck a deep chord with the public, leading to widespread outrage. Many people took to the streets, holding protests and vigils to honor her memory. They demanded justice, calling for harsher penalties for her captors and for better protection for young women. The emotional response was palpable as communities came together to express their heartbreak and frustration over the justice system's failure. The media played a significant role in shaping public perception of the case. Newspapers and television outlets reported extensively on Junko's story, detailing the horrific events surrounding her abduction and abuse. This coverage sparked intense discussions about safety, youth crime, and the treatment of victims in Japan. The case became a symbol of the urgent need for legal reform and greater awareness of violence against women. Many articles highlighted the societal changes needed to prevent such tragedies from happening in the future, keeping Junko's story alive in the hearts and minds of the public. In the wake of Junko Furuta's tragic case, significant changes in laws and policies emerged in Japan. The public outcry and media attention highlighted the urgent need for reform, particularly concerning youth crime and victim rights. Lawmakers began to discuss stricter penalties for violent crimes, especially those involving minors. New legislation aimed to improve the legal framework surrounding victim protection and support services. This included enhanced measures for reporting abuse and better resources for victims seeking help. The government recognized the importance of addressing these issues to prevent future tragedies and ensure that victims received the justice they deserved. Junko's story continues to resonate deeply in Japan and around the world. It serves as a stark reminder of the critical need for justice and protection for victims. Activists and organizations have used her case to raise awareness about violence against women and the systemic failures that allow such crimes to occur. Her legacy pushes society to confront uncomfortable truths and advocate for lasting change, ensuring that her memory inspires ongoing efforts to protect the vulnerable and promote justice. The conversation around violence against women remains crucial today. Junko Furuta's tragic case has sparked ongoing discussions about the prevalence of such violence and the societal attitudes that enable it. Activists and organizations emphasize the importance of speaking out against these atrocities. They encourage victims to share their stories and seek help, breaking the silence that often surrounds such issues. Communities are increasingly coming together to advocate for change, pushing for better support systems and legal protections for victims. This ongoing dialogue is vital to raise awareness and foster a culture where violence is not tolerated and survivors are believed and supported. As we remember Junko Furuta, we honor her memory by reflecting on the lessons her story teaches us. Her tragic experience serves as a reminder of the urgent need for justice and protection for all victims of violence. By sharing her story, we can prevent future tragedies and advocate for a world where everyone feels safe and valued. Junko's legacy lives on in the fight against violence, inspiring us to speak out, seek justice, and work towards a future free from fear. Let us remember her not just as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience and the ongoing quest for justice. And with that said, thanks for watching True Stories. If this tale of mystery and superstition caught your interest, hit that subscribe button to join us for more fascinating stories from history's strangest corners. Until next time, stay curious.